Good evening and welcome to Selectmen's Roundtable. I'm Morris DiPaolo. I'm here with the other members of the board, Maureen Miller, John LeBeau, Henry Fitzgerald, Jim Kane has a son playing basketball somewhere. I think he couldn't make it. So tonight we're going to talk about an interesting and historic event that's going on in the town. We're going to be looking to replace our third town manager, but the second search in 60 years. Dick Carney retired after 40. Dan is going to retire. Dan Magato is going to retire right around 20 years here, just a couple of months short. So the manager has given us his notice, as you all know. Excuse me, and we announced that on our December 27th meeting. And his intention is to retire on July 6th of this year. So, having that before us, the board who appoints the manager now embarks on the process of looking for and offering a job and appointing a new manager. And to that end, we just last night, today is Wednesday the 11th.
Yep.
And last night at our meeting, we went through the bids for a consultant, and there were 4 bids submitted, and we decided to go with Community Paradigm, a gentleman named Bernie Lynch, who used to be the city manager in Lowell. And a few years ago, he started on the search business, and he worked for Wellesley and he worked for Amherst in their search, and apparently they were successful because they have new managers. So anyways, we've contacted, at this point, Mr. Magato has contacted Mr. Lynch, and he'll prepare the documents, and off we go. To begin the process, as you all know, we're going to have a public hearing on January 17th at 7 p.m. in the Selectmen's room, so that interested parties, any resident in town, any member of a board, can come and give us their input as to what they think we should be looking for in the next town manager. And so we're looking forward to that event and to get public input. And that information will be documented and taken into account as appropriate as we build our profile that we want for the new manager. So I don't want to talk for the whole thing, so I didn't know if anybody wants to pick up there, or I can keep going. It's up to you.
Well, Mo, as you mentioned, it doesn't happen often, but I think some could argue, I think I might argue, that this might be the most important thing a Board of Selectmen does. Back in 1953, when the Selectmen Town Manager Act was established, it split the executive branch of the town. Formerly, there was just a 3-member Board of Selectmen, and essentially we now have our 5-member board, which is the more political side of the executive branch, and the managers, obviously, the administrative side. And having that kind of system, keeping the chief administrative officer out of the political process, I think has proven very, very, very good for the town, and allowed the town to have such long, continuous, steady management. We've got a couple tough acts to follow, and a couple great decisions made by certain boards of selectmen, and I think we need to live up. We have a high expectation that I'm confident we're going to do a very good job on, but we've got to work on this.
And going back to when Dick Carney left and we were looking for the next town manager, as you all know, I was a member of the board that did that search and ultimately appointed Dan Magato. But I can remember discussions amongst ourselves of well, what are we going to do? How are we going to follow up this act? Because it was a difficult act to follow. And the consensus of the members of the board at the time is 6 years, this manager's going to be gone. There's no way he's going to be able to stand up to the constant comparison to Dick Carney. But we were proven wrong. We found, essentially, in my opinion, the modern day version of Dick Carney. Still a fiscal conservative, a little more open, a lot more open about sharing information, et cetera, which was really the next step in the evolution of town government. I'm hearing the same thing from people out on the street now. What are we going to do? How are we going to replace Dan? And there is apprehension because you don't know when you're making a change like this. And when you're used to stability, you don't want to have to do this every 3, 6, 9 years or whatever. So it's going to be an interesting process, and it'll be interesting to see who comes forward who is interested in running the town for us.
You mentioned, oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I'm not that worried about it, though. And in the big picture, this is going to be an opportunity for somebody. And, it wasn't all that long ago our parents considered working for a company all their lives, for example, to be the epitome of what a career would be. That's probably nowhere near the epitome of what people think when they're changing jobs probably every 3 to 4, 5 years. And I don't think it's unreasonable, as you said, that if we get a town manager, we'd love to have longevity, but I don't know if that's realistic. And if a town manager, I would be surprised if a typical town manager is any more than 5 years on the job. As you go through any of these kinds of high-profile positions, there's a certain amount of newness, getting involved, and then in some cases moving on to better opportunities for them. They learn, they grow, and they want other opportunities. So I don't look at this as necessarily worried about it. I think it's just an opportunity for us to see what good candidates are potentially out there, and how can we handle it as long as we can be refined in what we're looking for, not too divergent on our views. And given our history, I tend to think that we'll be more similar in our views than divergent. So I'm not particularly worried about it. It's just a process.
Yeah, I agree. I think the whole thing had changed. I think it's changed. The community gets a little nervous about change. I think the departments do. I mean, there's certainly we do, and so your tendency is to want to hold on to what you have. And I think Henry's right. I think you have to embrace it, look at it as opportunity. I think personally, I'll be looking for someone who can honor the tradition and the culture of today, but also recognize, as you said, Mo, that this is a transition period. It's time for potentially new thoughts, new ideas. How do you balance that? And so, I'm looking forward to the process and meeting people and seeing what what they bring to the community, and how they obviously all of us are going to be looking for someone who is going to help us maintain that stability that everyone has come to expect from leadership in the town of Shrewsbury.
Right. I think part of the reason why the managers have stayed so long in this town, and they were asked some other towns that are similar to ours, is the boards have been pretty responsible. Didn't go off the deep edge like some of the other towns and be erratic and really get political about the manager's job. A lot of managers have left because they can't handle that, but some of them left because boards change and people get different ideas, much radically different from other members who have been on previously, and they don't click. So I think our town is more interested in stability, continuity, yes, looking at new ideas. And our board typically has been more, as Jim says, running interference with the manager so that the manager can do his job, whoever that might be. Let them focus on the administrative duties and the strategic planning and that. And we do the bigger more public, community-oriented issues. So,
I do think, though, that I could only assume back when Mr. Carney came into being, if someone really wanted to speak to him, they had to come in and see him. 40 years later, we have a variety of other mechanisms, and what Dan Morgado faces today is everything from Facebook to tweets to every other conceivable method of communication that probably has more people involved in comments of one sort or another than any other time in our history. And so while we're looking for people who will have a certain amount of feel for tradition, I mean, they're going to have to be, up on top of the latest in a way we're going to communicate with the public. And that's going to be a big part of the job going forward.
And I think that is it's going to be a big issue that's going to come to the forefront during the search. And it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of people are going to say that we need to get more actively involved, which I think we all know we do, to get involved in the digital media, Facebooks, whatever, Twitters of the world, whatever they are. Who knows what they'll be next year, but communication is different now. And I think that's one of the things, and Dan has said himself, the next manager is probably going to have to be more attuned to social media, than he was. The other thing is, Dan saw tremendous growth in the town. We grew, it's got to be close to 15,000 people when he was here. Just one 10-year period. You were on the board, John. We jumped 10,000 people.
Yeah, I mean, I think when Dan began, it was in the 20s somewhere, probably below 25, I think, and now we're 35.
30s, yeah.
So, tremendous growth. I mean, Henry, to what you said about a 5-year lifespan, I think, I shouldn't call it a lifespan, but a 5-year term of office. And that's the average. So that's when you take a guy like Dan who did it for, who's an incumbent. I think it truly is, from the Managers Association, 6 or 7 years is the average term of office for a manager, and it's changed a great deal. I mean, this communication issue. It's a 24/7 job now. I mean, with these methods of communication. Mr. Carney worked very hard, but if Mr. Carney went away on vacation, call long distance, see if you can find Mr. Carney. I do know that Dan has been away on vacation or time off, and the phone starts lighting up, and he's texting back to Shrewsbury, emailing back to Shrewsbury, family events. It changes the nature of the job. I think we should also mention, because this is sort of an informative session, that there's very specific requirements in the Town Manager Act and in state law. A manager can only be appointed to a 3-year term. That's the maximum a town can do without, I think, maybe with special legislation you can get more. And we've traditionally had 3-year terms. We also have a residency requirement in the Town Manager Act that requires whomever the board appoints become a resident of the town within 12 months. I'm not saying that I'm really have come to any conclusion about that, but I'd be interested to hear, say, when we have this public hearing, and I do know that if we were to change it, we would have to go to town meeting, and then we'd have to go to the legislature, and I don't know if it even would be feasible for this process. But in this world of the 24/7 constant communication, is it as important that the manager be a resident of the town? Now, I know many will argue that of course it is, that you want the manager to have to deal with the quality of the roads that are being plowed, if they have children, the quality of the schools. But many towns don't. I mean, I did this on a much smaller scale in a much smaller town for almost 6 years where there was no residency requirement. And there's pluses and minuses both, I think, for the community because you can perhaps attract a wider range or scope of applicants, but also for the individual. Some individuals may want to be right there in it, may choose not to be, might already have strong roots in another community where their family is, their kids are going to school. So I'd be curious to talk about that more, if it's even worth having the conversation.
Well, it's probably worth having the conversation, but it's too early to know if it's going to be a factor. I would think in the next month and a half, we're going to have some indication of it, because the consultant will be out reaching out to people and asking them if they'd be interested, and we'll get some feedback on it. But as you say, John, this process is going to, of necessity, be done in a short period of time, a doable period of time, but we don't have the luxury of a year and a half to go through. We could call a town meeting in 10 days, but we don't know how fast the legislature would move. And if we did find ourselves having to go in that position, we could find ourselves in the position of having to wait and have an interim town manager, which I think can be disruptive. An interim town manager is basically a caretaker, and I think you know more about this than it's keep it running, keep the town running.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it depends what the board wants. I mean, sometimes the board wants like a new sheriff to come into town to do, maybe to clean up, maybe to make some real significant changes that might lead to this individual probably not lasting long anyway. So that's one technique. But yeah, often it is a caretaker, and it's highly disruptive. I mean, this is our number one employee. I mean, that the board has to spend time on this. I mean, it's our responsibility, but it takes away from all the other things that we need to do, and it's going to divert staff to some degree. And I mean, we need to keep our eye on the ball of the day-to-day operations of the town, as the manager will, and to ease the transition. And actually, Mo, I mean, having you been through both going through the recruitment process, the hiring process, and you have observed, I mean, you've also been through, Dan's transition, Mr. Carney's retirement.
I thought you were going to say he was there for both.
Dan's transition in, and
almost,
and to help a manager, make that transition in. That's very important, and I think that's very helpful to make it the best transition as it can be. To have that institutional knowledge. I mean, and there you've been there, done that.
Well, and I think from a candidate perspective too, they're going to look at our community. All right, so it's not just us looking at them. The profile is put together, highlights our community and what we're about, and I think they will be looking very closely at the Board of Selectmen and other leadership and how stable that is and what roles we play. And I think to see that longevity and experience, I would think, would be something that a potential candidate would find very important.
Sure. I mean, forgive me, but speaking from experience, absolutely. I mean, when I thought about applying for a town administrator position, I reached out to some people I knew who knew that community, and I got a sense of the board because they're going to be your boss, and in 366 days, with the 2 election cycles, a majority of the board that appointed you could be gone. And so you have to think hard and fast about the board that's appointing you and what the pattern, you can never predict the future, but you can look and see what the pattern has been. And is it a quote unquote crazy town, or is it not?
One of the things that I was thinking of when we had this whole discussion is, what strikes me as different since the years I've been in town since 1977. So that not your longevities, but long enough to get a feel for it. And I always felt that it was a community dedicated to residential type of living and homes and the local schools. And I guess there's been the secondary push always for business development, economic development. But I think that's coming even more, in my opinion, coming more and more to the point where we have to even maybe give it more consideration as we go ahead. One, because we have limited opportunities. And two, we've had a few big projects come into town. There's potentially a few others. But, how can this person be the best ambassador to what we might be looking for? Again, my opinion, as to where the town might need to go. There's no doubt with 36,000 people in town, we're always going to be a strong residential community. But we have aspirations. We have aspirations to try and balance some of our budget with more favorable economic conditions. And I think we have to strive when we look for people who can be that ambassador to represent the town. Just as they're looking at the Board of Selectmen, we'd be looking for who could be the best spokesman for the person who represents the town of Shrewsbury. Again, just my opinion, but trying to give some thought as to where this might go and what might I be looking for and what kind of personality. I might be looking for a person, for example, is comfortable speaking to people and very comfortable, doing that kind of legwork that might get the businesses and stuff here. Again, just my opinion. So, and that by no means is, because we haven't had this discussion.
Yeah, right.
That's a good part of it. We personally haven't had this discussion. So while I hesitate to even bring it up, it's just something that strikes me as, some of the kinds of things that might be different this time around than maybe where we were 20 years ago. Even though I did not participate in that process, I was still a member of the town, though.
Well, the interesting thing is, I think the new manager is going to have a different perspective on how town hall should be organized. And I don't mean totally disruptive, but it might want a finance director, might want an HR director. There's a lot of discussion with Dan over the years that there's really a need for it, but it never seemed to be the right time for it. So it's going to be interesting to see what this candidate thinks about how we're organized and what that candidate might propose. And at the same time, we should mention we're going to be looking for a treasurer-collector probably starting in another month, because our treasurer-collector is leaving effectively July. It's August, but with her accumulated time, Carolyn will be leaving early, a little bit earlier than that. And that's a process where somebody has to give notice. You typically, with managers' jobs, you're given 60, 90 days, right, John? If they're in another position, they're not in between.
Well, you may have a contractual requirement that you give that much notice. I mean, it depends on what the contract is, I guess.
Right.
I had to give 6 weeks notice when I left Princeton. That was what my contract said, but I mean, I think that's the result of individual contract negotiations.
Right. So, anyways, we're going to be doing that. There's a possibility of others that are going to be replaced, because we have department heads that are at the age and time in town that they've accumulated the time, and they're getting to the age where they may not retire this year or next year, but within the next few years, there's several who are eligible for that and may do it. So it's going to be an interesting several years. As far as the process goes, we are going to have the public hearing on the 17th. We'll be working with the consultant to try to build a profile. Once we get that, there'll be advertising, and then resumes will be received. So hopefully by the end of February, according to the schedule that we've put together, and which has basically been agreed to by Mr. Lynch, he concurs with it. By the end of February, the first week in March, we'll be at the point where we could be looking at referrals and talking about semifinalists. And the end back here in February. March would be a whole series of interviews, selection of finalists, background checks, finalist interviews, selection probably the third week in April. Or the selection, the actual selection, selection the third week in April, and hopefully have negotiation of contracts in place by the end of April. And that will give anybody who has to give a long time of notice, a long lead time, give them at least 2 months.
Sure.
And if we have to run in between without a town manager, it might only be for a short period of time. So it's a doable schedule, but we're going to be busy because all of this is also going to be happening in the middle of budget season.
And I'm sure maybe John could comment on this. You'd like a little bit of overlap. I don't know, maybe a week is too short, but a month is too long. But there's some period of time that you'd want to have some ability to get the feel for the lay of the land, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think it really very much depends on the individuals in the organization. But I think certainly some overlap is wise. Absolutely.
Right. So, off we go. This is really going to be an interesting time for the town. I think people are going to really be paying attention and really follow what's happening, because this is going to be a big change for us.
Yeah, and I think, excuse me, you mentioned the public hearing next week, January 17th. I think that's really important for people to come, express their opinions and what they think from the manager, or if they can't attend, send an email. But it's very important for us to get that response, that feedback, because as we've said collectively here, many times already, the town has changed.
Yeah.
And it's changed in a number of different ways. So we need to hear, I think, from various constituents to help sort of pull that together, make sure we make the right decision.
Right. So here we are at the end of another Selectmen's Roundtable.
You want to mention the public hearing again?
The public hearing will be January 17th. I don't know how many times this will run between now and then, but
At 7 p.m.
we are putting notice
Right.
out through the posting of posting the meeting, getting it out on social media, letting through email, letting the various department heads, the boards and commissions, town meeting members, to try to get as much input as we can. So off we go, an interesting year. In another few weeks, February, we'll be starting the budget process. So stay tuned for more Selectmen's Roundtable, and prepare yourself for an interesting spring. Thank you, and good night.